Okay, so hello everyone. Today my goal is to cover a wide variety of topics under the umbrella of how Marxist Leninists should approach automation, AI, and the growing data economy. There's much debate that I've noted among not just Marxists, but in Australia in particular amidst the union movement. And I'm sure, of course, there are conversations being replicated almost everywhere at the moment about the crossroads we're currently facing on these topics. In other words, do we head down the path of accepting and embracing automation, or do we focus our energy and resources on staving back the tide and keeping the full employment demands alive? I have with me today a comrade, Marxist Leninist, and CPA organizer with a background in science, Christian Goopy, and another good comrade, as well as a recently graduated PhD student who teaches sociology at RMIT, Alexander Waters.
Hi there.
Hey guys.
Thanks for having me.
How's it going?
So, Alex, you've also just submitted a thesis positing the question of whether a neo-feudal economy might arise under the rule of a technocratic tyranny. I might be butchering it a little bit, but you can correct me if you like. So that's something I want to delve into later as well. So there's quite a lot to dig into in this episode, and what I think I would like to kick off with is the question of automation. How should Marxists respond to this question? Is there a correct position that can be universalized, or is it a case-by-case basis? For me personally, I lean towards the argument that automation is an inevitability. Last I looked at the statistics on this, the prediction was that around 5 million jobs will be lost to automation in Australia alone. And in America, I believe it's 2 million manufacturing jobs predicted to be replaced by robots. Almost 40% of jobs that exist today in terms of typical industries that we now think of will be completely lost to automation. As an example, the most valuable company in the US in 1964, AT&T, had 758,611 employees. And now the most valuable company today, Apple, has around 137,000 employees. So though today's big companies make billions of dollars, they share that income with fewer employees, and more of that profit goes to their shareholders. So it's arguable to say that, automation is happening now. In the US, coronavirus has already become an excuse for automating jobs. I believe mid-March, toll booth workers across parts of the US were replaced by machines and have been deployed to take people's temperatures. And if people are just thinking of robots that, work in warehouses, for example, then they probably need to seriously reconsider what's possible. So obviously we have more obvious ones like drivers, doctors, increasingly soldiers, and there is now more recent talk about the possibility of creating, I suppose, what you would call cyborg soldiers, in the sense of combining computers with human beings or biohacking them to make them more effective or ruthless soldiers, as well as security. And of course, right now, security bots don't look particularly frightening. I have seen a few in California, and they're not that scary, but they won't be this underdeveloped forever. But also, less well considered positions, for example, like lawyers. There are some companies at the moment that have replaced almost entirely their low-level junior law work with AI, and many that are planning on doing the same thing soon, and other positions that people might not consider, like writers, for example. I know personally from experience, having worked as a copywriter, that the threat of automation is just ripe to hit my industry already, because there are plenty of consumer AI machines now that can search the internet and write a 500-word piece under the theme required on whatever topic you give it, and it will probably be more effective at manipulating search engine optimization than a human being. For those who don't know what that is, it just means getting Google rankings higher based on key terms, which is right now a manual task, but might not be forever. Similarly, I know that workers in Silicon Valley, like computer engineers or cybersecurity and so on, that they are actually rewarded for figuring out how to automate much of their own work. So we aren't actually talking about a low-level tide of automation or only low-level work being replaced with AI. AI can absolutely replace, some of the most high-level work in society, and it's not something we're building up to. It's happening now. In my experience, and we're talking about something that will almost completely reshape the expendability of a human being in a capitalist economy. So what do you guys think? Christian, do you think automation is an inevitability or something we can stave off for a while?
The big part of the question really is what we really mean by automation. I think if we mean like the development of artificial general intelligence and associated hardware platforms that fully 100% eliminate human beings from the labor process, I don't think that the level
Mm.
of like productive forces or the technology exists to really answer this question, though it might be really interesting to consider scenarios by which an artificial general intelligence does allow for complete human implementation and what kind of societies or what kinds of mode production this could like firstly happen under and what the effects on society would be with this technology appearing but it being under different modes of production, like what would it mean if it happened under capitalism versus if it happened under socialism. However, if we were to talk about the current
Mm.
implementation of networked and data-driven systems with their associated hardware platforms, and this process really is deeply underway, um, and in many ways, much more rudimentary versions of this have been occurring throughout the existence of capitalism, with first editions of the first creations of factories and steam-driven machinery had an automating effect on the industry at the time in a way. And I think that, and Marx did write about this process, and he has a few good points that do relate to what we could view
Mm.
as early automation. Um, like having described the effect of technological change during the Industrial Revolution and increasing the depth of the labor pool, because the addition of these machines meant that women and children could be employed in these early massive factories, and it's also affecting lengthening the working day. Marx says that the most given that the most powerful instrument for shortening labor time, and by this it means the time needed to produce a given commodity, it becomes the most unfailing means for placing every moment of the laborer's time and that of his family at the disposal of the capitalist for the purpose of expanding his capital. That observation by Marx in chapter 15 of volume 1 of Capital, I think, is really interesting to consider the effects of the enclosure of the internet through these social media platforms, which I think we'll be talking about later on in this podcast episode.
Sure. Well, let's just touch on that first. So, do you think that it's a matter of expanding technological capacity? Because obviously, during the Industrial Revolution, expanding the automation that occurred during that period was obviously a result of expanding British imperialism, and increasing technological innovation of a kind that society hadn't seen prior as a result. And obviously now AI is being, the AI revolution, quote unquote, is being compared to the Industrial Revolution in that sense as well. So do you think we aren't quite there yet? Is that what you're arguing?
In some ways, I think we're not quite there yet, but at the same time, I think that the process that's occurring at the moment is quite similar to a process that has always occurred under capitalism, which has also had quite significant social dislocative effects. Um, the Luddite movement, for instance, had happened where weaver workers went and smashed machines in England in response to the correctly perceived threat of the loss of their jobs and the destruction of their skills and their industry by this. Um, was kind of being driven by pressures that are similar to what many workers face and experience today. Um, I guess another
Mm.
example that we could consider is the current lockout of about 350 workers at Smead and Grange at the Coles warehouse
Yeah.
just near Campbelltown. That's being driven by a struggle, and this is an example of one sort of union response in terms of trying to get concessions around automation. But their warehouse is going to be largely automated, or it'll be shut down in about 2023 and then reopened as a largely automated warehouse with a large loss of jobs. And the 3 month lockout that Coles has done is in response to a demand for very strong redundancy packages for many of the workers there, many of them whom have worked there for about 20 to 30 years at the very most, and also the failure for cops to provide any guarantees for workers to be able to be trained and redeployed to work in this largely automated new warehouse for those who aren't ready to retire yet. So I think that that's maybe like one micro example of the sort of things that happen at the moment.
Yeah, so surely that does speak to a growing demand, though, for for the efficiency, and presumably, it's cheaper in general. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there wouldn't be this demand from employers to do things like automate whole warehouses. So surely we are sort of heading in that direction. Alex, what do you think? Do you think automation is an inevitability, or do you think it can be staved off as well?
Yeah, I definitely don't think it can be reversed. So, I mean, we have to sort of move from the position that we're already in terms of like existing, computer technology, the internet, all these sort of developing systems of automation and so on. In terms of like the rapidity of like their development, and like for me, the question of technologies is much more about who's in control rather than technology itself. So, I mean, we could develop all sorts of new kinds of technology based on you know trying to repress say migrants trying to cross borders. We could develop all kinds of new repressive technologies for police, like militarizing drones and urban assault vehicles, and giving as you were sort of hinting at, like artificial intelligence and weapons to artificial intelligence robots and so on. Or, I mean, we could put technology to a very different purpose, and use it to create more free time for the average person. Use it to promote the general welfare. I mean, this is a really central sort of political question for our era. I think technology itself has to
Yeah.
be as a field of struggle. So we have to sort of treat, in terms of what that means concretely. Obviously, we've already hinted at the major platform economy sort of corporations like, say, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on. We have to treat those as really, really central to the way the whole economy works, because increasingly, there's no more. I mean, after the coronavirus crash is over, there's not going to be any small business left, really. It's all about this handful of giant sort of platform corporations. Everything is being done on them. We're all being sort of herded, kind of like, I guess, the landless sort of peasants, in the enclosures sort of process, in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. We're all being herded into this sort of platform economy. That's all you have to do. All your consumption, all your marketing your wares, your labor, everything happens there. So we have to treat those sites as fields of struggle. And I would say we should be making demands for nationalizing those platform economy firms at the nation scale level. I realize that's complicated because they're multinational corporations, and obviously if you nationalize, say, I don't know, the Australian part of Amazon, you still leave intact a global network and whatever. But I think that's probably one of the demands we should be thinking about.
Well, right. And I mean, you're not wrong that the Australian government has recently attempted to regulate Facebook. Whether or not that's a good thing or not, I think, is probably another question, because there is something a little bit dodgy about Murdoch, for example. Murdoch and his buddies essentially attempting to scoop some money off the top of Facebook and Google.
Yeah.
The workers don't really have a say in that fight, so to speak. Really, it's one form of capital, a dying form of capital against a new form of capital, basically. But the Australian government, in doing so, kind of proved that they're not above regulating tech companies.
Yeah.
But one of the things that just going back to what you mentioned, Christian, with what we can do in the here and now, because I tend to I'm an excessively, I guess, almost utilitarian person at times. One of the things that kind of frustrates me, I think, at the union movement at the moment, is that there seems to be a false level of hubris about what can actually be done to stave off automation. At least when I talk to union organizers, that is, and not, obviously, I think union organizers are heroic, but just the general sense I get, because as an example, the maritime unions work on holding off, I believe it was automating parts of the process of loading and unloading ships at the ports, and their campaign against it was certainly heroic. I know that they appealed to the UK and the US and many other European countries who similarly, in a symbol of international work and solidarity, fought this form of automation so that monopoly companies had less room to move and were essentially forced out of implementing it. But I'm not sure that's a sustainable tactic for the union movement broadly in the long term. And I'm not saying that because I don't think international worker solidarity in general is sustainable. But like similar to the instance that you mentioned, Christian, as another example, Woolworths warehouse workers were, I think, at the beginning of this year, completely replaced by robots in certain parts of Australia. And they were replaced not just because their union doesn't have enough teeth, but because what bargaining power is there if the whole work site can be replaced by machines? You can't threaten to walk off if that's literally what the boss wants you to do. Bad PR doesn't necessarily bother bosses much. I mean, just look at Amazon. So regardless of whether or not it's an objectively good idea, there is a serious issue of the union movement think that how they will continue to fight for full employment is by using old tactics that only worked when we don't have machines that can do a human's job for faster and cheaper, right? Because strikes are no longer a sustainable organizing tactic. So what is left then? I've genuinely seen some workers becoming so desperate when faced with the reality of your automation, that they think that something more akin to property damage would work instead. I think people thought that people like Andrew Yang were just being overly dramatic or something when he talks about truck drivers when they were being replaced by self-driving trucks trying to just go and block off the road and get their guns out, right? But I don't think he is, because I've seen for myself people very seriously considering similar actions in response to the threat of self-driving trucks or self-driving trains, for example. So, I know I sound dystopic, but I think we need to be thinking realistically about our future and the radical measures that it will take to contend with them. And I think in some ways that requires the union movement rethinking about how they approach automation. And if they are going to stave it off, developing new creative ways of doing so. What do you guys think?
Well, if I may, the first one with the truck drivers, I think there's nothing like the threat of your own livelihoods to cause you to undertake the most radical of measures like property damage, which even under civil law is quite severely punished by the state. In terms of the existing union responses, really, there's only kind of two basic responses that I've kind of can think of at the moment, which is what you've just said, to stop or delay the diffusion of automation, of which the MUA at the docks, at the kind of waterfront, really, I think is the premier example of, at least in Australia. However, I think that the only reason why it's tenable for them to be able to do this is because the automation solution that's been actually proposed to them is currently inferior in terms of productivity to a human workforce at the present time. And the reason why automation is being driven in this case is union busting. But I think that you're right that it is largely inevitable that there will be that this kind of strategy will not be able to last forever, even if you have the global sort of waterfront kind of organized to fight it across borders, which is a really impressive achievement, but you only need to fail once in the struggle for there to be really significant losses. The other strategy is what I talked about before, which is getting concessions in redundancies and redeployments for existing workers. But the problem with this is that even if you're able to secure some stuff that is good for existing workers, such as an early kind of boosted up retirement for people kind of close to retirement age, or jobs for a certain period of time for people who aren't close enough to retirement, there still is like some significant and big questions left about the jobs and I guess the labor content of that industry going on in the future, which I don't think that. I think it's difficult in terms of a union process of because like unions really fundamentally are about controlling the price of labor in a way, and if you have these massive labor displacing disruptions coming in from the capital side, then there's some serious difficulties for labor to be able to fight this. And I think we need to really look closely, I guess, at what sort of struggle was needed to preserve the existing living standards for workers, but also what we can do to force concessions for everyone else, really. And in this, the unemployed workers movement and organizations in this area, like the unemployed union, really needs to be strengthened and closely looked at. As when we talk about unions and workers organizing, we don't actually mean the unemployed enough, even though in the Great Depression, the Communist Party at the time was very clear, like unemployed workers are workers and have to be organized to fight the enormous imposition on their living standards that unemployment is given to them. And I think if we're able to make the unemployed people organized and scary enough as communists, then it really does force open the potential for a whole heap of concessions to try and reduce the level as to how scary this is. Though I think that there's also limits as to what we could do with this at the same time.
Yeah. Sorry, go, Alex.
I just wanted to agree with what Christian was saying there towards the end about the the benefits of organizing the unemployed workers. I think also just to sort of build on what you were saying, Christian, the expansion of like the social base for any leftist movement that's seeking to sort of challenge the problems of automation and attacks on workers' living standards and so on, I think we should really consider the underclass, the lumpen proletariat, as a revolutionary subject as well, and not just sort of think of the traditional base of industrial workers. I forgot what I was going to say before. In terms of that question you were posing before, Gemma, about what strategies we should be sort of pursuing in light of these attacks, I wanted to say also, so if the sort of traditional industrial strike action and the disruption of like the production process by workers themselves isn't being effective. I think there's still a lot we can actually do to exercise like collective power on behalf of everybody in society who isn't benefiting from like the current sort of form of capitalism we're living under. I mean, one thing I think is really powerful is the idea of not necessarily the workers themselves, but everybody like in a sort of more sort of maybe labor sort of alliance with social movements, sort of seeking to disrupt the networks of like distribution and production of goods themselves. So like if you think of port work, a really great example of this, but also like everybody who works, in the airports, everybody who works, in the transport sort of sector, there are all of these nodes in, the network that could be disrupted there. I think there's a lot of potential for like exercising collective power if it could be organized more effectively. It doesn't necessarily have to be done like in a centrally coordinated sort of singular union campaign either. I think like there's been some really inspiring examples from have you guys seen like recently there's been a few like global Uber strikes and like Deliveroo like strikes, those sorts of things. There's no central union coordinating this. This is all just like spontaneous worker organized action. So I think like it's very much in its infancy, obviously, those sorts of collective action and trying to disrupt the flow of capital and the flow of profits. But yeah, I think there's lots more that could still be done. I wouldn't give up hope on the idea of collective action entirely, even if the traditional sort of industrial strike maybe isn't as effective as it used to be.
Well, just to clarify, I wasn't saying that strikes weren't effective in the context of a precarious economy like, Uber, or I guess even Amazon, things like that. I mean, obviously, that still works, and I think it's fantastic that people are working out how to organize themselves, essentially, because it's become a necessity. But my point is, in the context specifically of automation, even if you had a solidarity strike with a warehouse that was being replaced by robots, for example, it still wouldn't do much, because the robots are the union busters, and they are presumably, in most contexts where they are replacing whole warehouses, they are cheaper and faster than human beings. So, solidarity strikes or walking off, or even, a PR campaign of some kind isn't going to work in that context.
No, of course.
Yeah.
I guess it depends how mature the automation process really is as well, because transitioning anything in any organization, particularly in companies, can take time to really do and be rolled through. And from what I can tell, most automation processes tends to be kind of bit by bit rather than everything at once.
Yeah. Just to finish that thought on social movement strategy, the one that I didn't mention, which is really important, is what I talked about in my thesis, that Podemos has been really successful with, which is sort of like essentially it's just Leninism, like taking over the state. So this can be thought of as a social movement strategy, in the sense that Podemos has developed like a whole ecology of counter-hegemonic sort of institutions in both the media and in terms of organizing their base of supporters and getting them sort of engaged, and actually going out and taking over like city councils, and ultimately entering the federal government, which they've been in since the beginning of this year.
Well, I think as Marxist Leninists, we'll all agree that obviously attempting in any way to take over state infrastructure is a great idea. Yeah,
absolutely.
And obviously, that speaks to the possibility of, again, organizing for nationalizing parts of tech infrastructure that, infiltrate Australia to some degree. And I mean,
if I may, comrades, I had an observation that I just want to make in relation to what Alexander previously said in relation to we should be prioritizing nationalizing these massive conglomerates like Amazon, and the problem that happens when you only nationalize a little piece of this overall kind of corporate thing. If you're nationalizing it, you should be seeking to take everything, including the intellectual property that they have, including the secret intellectual property they have. And something that we should also remember is that when the Soviet Union came into existence, or in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, they published all of the secret treaties of the land claims that the Allies had divided up between themselves, which at the time was an enormous sort of scandal, and it was part of what caused the West to pursue a strategy of isolating Russia after the Great October Socialist Revolution. But I think that there's another set of secret treaties, which is all of the intellectual property and so on that these massive conglomerates have, and what the effect of a post-revolutionary state just publishing everything in the open domain could possibly have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, China is a fantastic example of that. In areas with high levels of technological production in China, there is a sort of almost a free-for-all. They have I think they're called meetups or similar to that, where basically, you have, like tech fairs and things like that. because there is almost no restrictions on IP, that there's almost ironically more kind of innovation occurring at the lower level that a lot of people claim capitalism breeds, but obviously it's actually occurring more kind of creatively and to a greater degree under a quote unquote socialist state than a capitalist one like in Silicon Valley, because obviously their tech fairs, if you want to be a startup in Silicon Valley, you have to contend with constant competition around patent laws, and there's really often not a lot you can do. You can't often build off other ideas or businesses, so to speak, for that reason. So yeah, that's definitely a big one as well. But I guess it also poses the challenge of, if one country wants to nationalize one piece of a monopoly, then the patents or the IP doesn't go with that, which or generally probably won't come alongside it. So I guess it's another question of how workable is it.
Well, it's part of why I suggest bust open the corporate secrets and bust open all of the kind of back end type stuff for everyone to be able to see, because that would just kind of tank their share prices and whatnot. Because even though the patent and stuff, because the way in which patents work is you put into public domain the invention that you have made, but in return for putting it into the public domain, you get an exclusive monopoly conferred on you by the state. But secret kind of information or corporate secrets, they're corporate secrets. They're not protected by the state or any laws in any way other than the secrecy that the company maintains to protect it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the other question is something that is constantly raised around this particular topic is universal basic income. And, obviously in many ways, because we're facing these challenges, we have to rethink what work is and rethink how we fight for what we want in that sense. So as an example, if what will primarily be replaced is high-level cognitive work and physical labor, then that still leaves room for a whole variety of work that provides a positive social function still. For example, there are certain forms of research that can only be done that requires a level of creativity that we're unlikely to use anything other than humans for in the future, and social programs to increase the general education of the populace and improve social well-being, which, can be done using heavy state investment into these industries and funded, of course, by wealth generated from automated labor, if we have these kind of systems that we want. And then, of course, there is the question of a UBI. So the left tend to have one of two responses to the question of a UBI that I've noticed. Firstly, that there are reservations around a UBI potentially being an excuse to undercut wages. And, it's often pointed to the fact that Milton Friedman and, conservative economists like that tend to support a UBI, or possibly increase, over-casualization, such that it may be used as a way to bolster private systems. Or secondly, and admittedly, I'm not sure if this is a fringe internet Marxist take or not, but that it will placate the labor aristocracy, quote unquote, if you believe there is a definitive labor aristocracy, which is a term I'm very skeptical of myself, and that it would necessarily be held up by imperialism. So as for the first question, I can understand why people have reservations. People like Andrew Yang, for example, who recently became more popular for promoting a UBI, was a venture capitalist, and he was proposing a UBI that was quite low, although not that low by American standards, because I know that people in places like Michigan, for example, actually earn less than $1,000 a month. And I believe he also wanted to outsource welfare services. But I don't think this negates that if the left take up a demand for a guaranteed basic income or a universal basic income, that it can be, it can't be what we want it to be. In Australia, I tend to just phrase it as basically Centrelink with no mutual obligations, significantly higher earnings and significantly higher limits on earnings outside of welfare. So right now it'd be like raising the cap before they begin to cut off your Centrelink to something like 70K, for example. But then obviously there is the stigma that comes with something like being on Centrelink to begin with. So maybe it's something that does need a rethink. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking personally, I'm definitely for the idea of universal basic income. Obviously, it depends on the conditions in which the demand for it is made, and the who happens to be in power when that demand is being met by the state and enacted into law. I can see, I'd also say like the way in which it gets enacted at first isn't necessarily permanent. Like I would think of UBI as just like any other public service or any other sort of welfare sort of program. There's like in the Australian context, like when the ALP is in power, they might sort of moderately sort of expand it and make it slightly more generous or whatever. Maybe going back to the Whitlam era, this is sort of pre-neoliberal ALP, I guess. But and then obviously when the Conservatives are in power, they'll have their own version of their vision for a particular sort of welfare policy, and they'll cut it back and increase the rate of like means testing and restrict access and so on. I think UBI could be similar. So I mean, once it's been voted into law and it's there, I think we could experiment with it in a lot of different ways. I think obviously we on the left should be making the demand for it alongside a series of other reforms. Obviously, I mean, it needs to be part of a cohesive sort of worldview around expanding the general welfare. So it needs to be tied to, I think, like the average wage, for example, in terms of putting a concrete sort of level on it. I realize in the US there are people who can just about eke out an existence on $1,000 a month, like the Andrew Yang proposal, but I would really struggle to do that in Australia. I don't know about you guys, but
Well, it's less than our current welfare, so that's not it's not applicable to Australia, really.
that's true. But yeah, so I think it should be if we're going to make a demand for UBI, it should be something like tied to the minimum wage or the average wage or whatever it is. It also needs to be alongside. I don't know if you guys have heard the expression. This is a proposal that came out a few years after UBI sort of started to generate a lot of discussion on the left. Universal basic services. Have you guys heard that expression before, or have you talked about this?
No.
Cool. Okay. So I need to look up the journal article or wherever it came from, but the idea is so everything that we're supposed to be able to pay for with a UBI, why shouldn't we just have those things provided by the state directly? So, but basic services meaning say utilities, say housing. In the US, they have food stamps. I mean, we could talk about subsidizing food in various ways. And I think yes, some combination of the two would be the sort of way to think about this. So, and that way, I think it's much less of a threat to workers' living standards as well and their wages and conditions. We need to I think basic income alongside basic services and just sort of pushing for that sort of radical expansion of the welfare state. I think that's the way to sort of frame it. Obviously, I'm very afraid of the libertarian sort of version of this sneakily sort of getting imposed, and obviously everyone in Silicon Valley is keen on it in order to gut welfare and in order to dismantle what's left of public education and public healthcare and so on. But yeah, that would be my sort of approach. Christian, what do you reckon?
Well, I guess the primary thing that I think is pretty similar to what you do, which is the implementation of UBI,
Yeah.
or what it will look like, or what content it has, rather, I think is fully dependent upon the existing political questions and who's doing it, for what reasons, and what are the sort of class forces involved, and how powerful and how organized is the working class
Mm.
at that point where it's been implemented. In relation to what I see as being the, I guess, potential for the UBI that I don't think has been mentioned yet.
Mm.
On one hand, I'm not sure why leftists think that having a UBI would reduce living standards or increase casualization, because in the context of insecure work and everything else, the UBI is actually just a gigantic strike fund, really. If you're getting like a few thousand, if you're getting like $1,000 a month, even if you were getting 1,000 a month in Australia, even though that's considerably worse than Centrelink. If you're also working at the same time and you're in a casual thing, that ends up turning into a strike fund. Like you could, your entire kind of unionized workforce could just pull the UBI for doing whatever you want to do. But the thing that concerns me more isn't necessarily how it's funded, because I think that there's credible progressive ways in which you could fund a UBI without causing all sorts of broader macroeconomic problems. But the concern I have is its potential to smooth over internal class contradictions by recreating a stake in the existing system for a lot of people. Like, part of the reason why there's such massive political polarization and why really Marxism Leninism is back is because the sort of social compacts that tied people to the system, for instance, in Australia, the guarantee of employment and the almost certainty of being able to purchase a house that was available to the vast majority of the population for a long time has been completely ripped out under the feet of a whole heap of young people, and that kind of process of, and that very much was the means by which people were tied to the existing system. They had a stake in it. And it's what Marx really identifies when he says, like, workers have nothing to lose, but their chains have got the world to win. Because the internal processes of capitalism do produce a working class that has no stake in the system whatsoever. And that's the potential threat that there could be if a UBI was imposed under capitalism.
Mm.
So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, I definitely agree with your criticism of the left, that general kind of argument that it's going to somehow that it won't necessarily improve living conditions seems quite strange to me, because even right now, for example, the fact that they temporarily raised welfare is seen as a threat, because I mean it will mean that people will settle for a higher wage when they're entering back into the labor market. It's just it's one of Marx's primary ideas around the lumpen proletariat. So yeah, that seems crazy to me. But I think it's a really good point that both you and Alex made, that we have to be tackling the inflation in necessary commodities alongside it. Otherwise, there may be not so much of a point of a UBI to begin with.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, if it was really so predestined to stabilize the antagonisms underlying capitalism and just sort of pacify the working class, then I think like in the context of like the coronavirus, what are they called, the JobKeeper payments and so on, I feel like the state would be much more sanguine about like sustaining those, and much more relaxed. Whereas look at how panicked they are to cut it back. The fear that this has raised expectations of a better standard of living in response to a crisis is palpable. I mean, you can see it on their faces every time they appear on the news to announce, oh, we have to be the fiscally responsible and cut back the level to half of what it is, and we just have to throw whatever it was in the latest cutback. I think 700,000 people being put back below the poverty line as a result of the coronavirus payments, alongside New Start payments being cut back. So I think if we had a UBI at a similar level to those payments, this would have the effect of raising expectations, and like Christian was saying before, it would effectively function as a strike fund. It should be thought of as a way of even Peter Fraser talks about it as a sort of a way of decommodifying labor itself. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. Sorry, Jim, what were you saying?
Yeah, I mean, I am sympathetic to people who kind of look at this sort of general, I mean, it's almost a catchphrase among the Marxist Leninist left at the moment to say, fully automated luxury communism and whatever else. and think, well, this seems utopian. I mean, there is an element. Oh, all of a sudden we just have, everyone has a living wage, and all of us, and particularly for our generation, something like that is quite hard to imagine. And all of a sudden everyone has the freedom to just sort of be creative or indulge. Sometimes people even pose it as having the freedom to indulge in excess if they want to. And I do sympathize with the notion that that's not entirely a fantastic idea. I mean, obviously, something that communists don't do a lot is appeal to the sort of spiritual or the cultural sense that people in society generally have a need for purpose, basically. And obviously, if the capitalists or if capital is rolling out these programs, I understand why people might feel threatened by the concept that it may be some kind of broad conspiracy to turn us all into sort of this like degenerate lumpen proletariat, right? But I think that's why it's very important to phrase it in terms of, work is never going to completely disappear. I don't think that's a possibility in even remotely the near future. And what we actually need is essentially just for people to have freedom, because what is going to occur is growing, growing sort of horde of precariat labor, where the government is counting people who've done 2 hours of Uber driving a week a job, and people struggling increasingly to put food on the table. So I think there will ultimately end up just being a question of, firstly, how do we survive? And then secondly, these sort of broader questions of what does a utopia under some kind of universal basic income actually look like? You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's all very contingent, obviously, until we actually get like a concrete sort of proposal for a UBI, like to be adopted by the labour movement, and we sort of talk about the concrete sort of ideas about what demands we could be making. It's all sort of up in the air, so it's very abstract in this phase, I think.
Yeah. And I think it definitely plays into the point that Christian made before about perhaps, obviously this is only relevant insofar as we actually develop some power, as a working class, and really the only way that we can do that, particularly if we do have increasing levels of young people on like short-term contracts or on, only working a few hours a week, the only way that we can really do that is by strengthening things like unemployed workers unions or representation for the unemployed, because I think people really need to kind of rethink how they view unemployed organizing altogether, because I don't think they can really I think people who are unsympathetic to the idea generally don't understand that there is a whole new labor market where only 30% of Australians are working full time, for example, and that unemployed organising doesn't necessarily mean you aren't working. It means that you're barely working most of the time, right?
If I may, like with unemployed organising, I think part of the problem that there is with it, and particularly how people look at it, is that the existing organisations are really kind of infected with the Australian Council of Social Services view on how to do it, which is this whole sympathy thing where they prioritize on getting people to tell their story about how they have suffered and so on, and how they are deserving of like a better deal and so on. But this is combined with this really powerful aversions to any sort of real militancy that would produce the kind of frightening organized unemployed working class or working people that you would need to actually win these concessions on a permanent and ongoing basis.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've noticed that myself, trying to do some unemployed organizing in this country. I was essentially encouraged to keep all of my activism on Twitter, basically. And if the media asks for it, give a sob story about how I only ate 5 times or 3 times that week, or something like that. Which to me just seemed so self defeatist, and kind of playing on this idea that you can win votes via sympathy. And I don't personally think, particularly in Western countries, that you actually can win votes via sympathy. I mean, refugee campaign is a fantastic example of that in certain ways, because
Oh yeah, I was just thinking of that as an example. It's perfect.
yeah, because refugee campaigns, through the entire kind of like organizing in Australia, they've relied almost fully on on this argument that refugees are, basically anyone who doesn't care about the plight of refugees on Manus Island or anything like that are essentially just these like reactionary assholes. And you're basically a racist if you have anything so much as a even if you're just a tired worker and you don't really care because you have other concerns about like surviving. Generally they're just kind of playing off people's guilt, right? And playing off people's guilt generally doesn't work. Like the only thing that tends to work, if you look at the way that politicians function in this country and in America and elsewhere, is by appealing to what will immediately either benefit people or what will immediately, play into their fears, right? That's the only two kind of organizing tactics that actually work. And so I think we do actually have to learn how to frame these things in terms of, frame these campaigns in terms of how it will benefit people in their daily lives. And for refugee organizing, it can be, well, why are you spending excessive amount? Why are you allowing the government to spend excessive amounts of your taxpayer money on these like expensive for-profit private prisons, right? Why would you endorse that? Don't you want your taxpayer money to be put towards something more useful? And in the context,
no, exactly
sorry,
right. If I just make quickly, I think that Australian society, as it's configured, is kind of organized in sort of such a way, or the cultural factors are at play, to make it almost impossible to convince anyone on the basis of sympathy or guilt to change their mind, really. Like if guilt was gonna work as an organizing tactic, then you would see people's opinions about refugees and about the treatment of Indigenous people and I guess racism in society and these other cultural problems, there would have been far greater traction on them, when in actual fact there's been absolutely none. No one's mind's been changed at all, which is why what you've just said, Gemma, is so important, really.
Yeah. And by the same token, that's why whenever I talk to someone about, caring about unemployment or caring about the current Centrelink rate, even though there's, a very small percentage of people who actually are currently on Centrelink, I tend to frame it in terms of, well, I mean, for one, there is this growing threat of automation and you aren't necessarily safe from it. But aside from any particular fears, just simply the reality that something like a guaranteed basic income ensures that you fighting for a higher wage, or you eventually kind of negotiating with your boss for better conditions and a wage. I mean, not only that you're more comfortable to do so, but that necessarily there will just be a kind of natural flow of inflation in wages, purely from a policy like that. So I think we do have to frame it in terms of what will matter to workers. But the other problem as well is that the Australian Council of the ASOS that you were mentioning before, Christian, and the Unemployed Workers Union, they don't actually support a guaranteed basic income anyway. They actually argue for full employment, which I don't know if they are necessarily seeing the limitations that I see in that as well.
There's a chance not, but I think in any case, I think one of the important steps that I think needs to be taken. And this is a conversation I've had with some comrades around the place in Sydney, but also in Melbourne. Not in Melbourne, in Wollongong, is that the Australian Council of Social Services model of, I guess, pity and guilt needs to be really called out on for what it is, which is something that really disempowers unemployed workers, and something which also is a massive impediment towards any sort of effective organization and effective capabilities to make changes and gain wins in this area quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there was that whole Friendly Geordie scandal recently, but I mean, what matters to me a lot more about the Unemployed Workers Union is that they think being on Twitter is activism and that they think that, direct action is not something that you prioritize, or that actually appealing to like precariat workers, for example, or attempting to physically organize unemployed workers is not a priority, and that is a serious problem. I'm not sure if it's universal, but it's definitely something that we face in Australia for sure. So yeah, as for the second concern, again, I don't know if this is necessarily just an internet kind of concern, but I personally, I don't see why people sort of make, I guess it's almost a third worldist argument that imperialism is a precondition for automation to occur in the West. If anything, the idea is supposed to be bringing back manufacturing first, and then to have a domestic market and a growing export market as a source of wealth for the state to, redistribute money into a new economy as automation expands. So protectionism would be necessary. But this seems like mostly a moot point to me because, if a UBI were to occur under a government that was imperialist, then I can see why people would be skeptical of placating the quote-unquote labor aristocracy, but even then, that predicates an accelerationist argument which determines that the West have to experience a decline in living standards in order to either break down Western control or to even themselves with the global South. And this sort of, in my mind, descends into third worldist thinking that I'm personally not a fan of. I don't think a breakdown in Western living standards or social cohesion will lead to socialism personally, and I just simply don't actually want to see workers in the West suffer as much as I don't want to see imperialist wars, and I don't see why they're constantly kind of put at these loggerheads with one another by Marxist Leninists quite as much as they are. Certainly right now, Western workers are subsidized by cheap global South labor, but they don't actually have to be, and that's the point of bringing back productive industries so that they do so with expanding automation and technology. What do you guys think about that?
Well, if I may, I think that part of the problem is I don't think that these communists or these Marxist Leninists have necessarily had taken a close look at the kind of the economics and how this would actually be funded and everything. Funnily enough, one of the most compelling arguments as to how to completely domestically fund a UBI from, I guess, a progressive standpoint was this largely Georgist proposal, which suggested doing strong land taxes and having strong state intervention into the economy to be building infrastructure, like high-speed rail in Australia, and all these other things. So you could just max out the land value gain and capture that in the land tax, and then spend a significant proportion of that on the UBI, which will allow people to live in distributed places across Australia, but would also allow for investment in advancing productive forces like scientific research and other sorts of technological research, creating space and opportunities for people to do startups in various different forms. I don't know why people don't think of, like, there's a lot of startup discourse that exists in the kind of Silicon Valley types and start your own capitalist business and whatnot. But there's no reason why workers who are empowered by a UBI or a strike fund couldn't also be setting up cooperatives of the correct resources and information and kind of organizing tools. And also, we're kind of conditioned with the right sort of expectations as to what you're actually doing with that this couldn't produce something that is deeply progressive compared to the current system, that also wouldn't be based upon exploitation of other countries. I think the important thing in this, though, is that you would end up redistributing wealth in such a way through a land tax and through some of these other taxes on finance, that you would probably be coming into massive conflict with the ruling class, and you would need to have workers' power or socialism to sort of make it work in the first place. But there's options and there's alternatives there if people do think about the economics and actually do look for positive solutions. I think it's just people's guilt or liberal or hidden liberalism that's coming up when they make these statements.
Yeah, completely. I agree with Christian's assessment there. I do find like it's tempting to sort of go along with the third worldist sort of analysis, and you mentioned before the idea of the labor aristocracy in North Timor. But yeah, ultimately it's pretty naive thinking at the end of the day. Like you have to look at our own conditions also as well, like in the national context. We have to confront our own capitalist class and deal with our own version of capitalism here, and there's no sense in like appealing or I suppose you wouldn't call it appealing. There's no sense in a strategy based on the idea of appealing to the popular class and saying, "Oh, we need you to like experience like immiseration and like deepening like living standards, and yeah, you're just gonna have to suffer for like half a century or whatever until the global south catches up to your level of wages and whatever." I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Christian, as well, that it probably does often just come down to not actually understanding the economics of how something like this would play out. Particularly, I think generally there seems to be this sort of moralistic, kind of unreconstructed view of protectionism in general as something that is innately racist. Which I guess questions like Brexit and any sort of anti-globalization movement tends to get funneled into these sort of racist sort of associations. But then at the same time, obviously, we kind of ignore that communists historically were the sort of the greatest proponents of protectionist rises in living standards, or rises in living standards via protectionism rather. So yeah, it seems to be perhaps oftentimes just misunderstanding, and then a sort of weird combination of that with quite a lot of liberalism or guilt.
Can't people fall in for our own version of the Iron Curtain, really?
Yeah.
just to be a little edgy here.
Well, I mean, exactly, and why shouldn't we? I mean, what is the point of professing to be a communist or a socialist in the global north if you aren't actually interested in raising the living standards of the people in your own country? I mean, are you only interested in doing charity for the global south? Because as a worker in the West, that would be the only service you would provide as a third worldist, so it doesn't seem particularly practical or logical to me.
Time to go and join Oxfam.
Exactly. I mean, or maybe you can be a better charity than Oxfam, and that would be the best you could aim for, but that would be about it. So I guess this kind of brings us into what happens if the capitalists win. What are we heading towards? So something that I've been keeping my eye on is the rise in Google cities and the expanding overarching control of tech companies, and in the way of like leading up reported coronavirus recovery, which you mentioned before, Alex. But it begs the question, what does that actually mean? And what would a kind of coronavirus recovery led by tech companies actually look like? Alexander, in your thesis, you make the claim that the techno-rentier oligarchs, I believe you call it, and techno-precariat commoners sort of create this sort of new neo-feudalism. But presumably what you're referring to is a decade onward of an expanding precarious class in the West operating at the behest of a handful of major tech corporations who essentially control everything, from what we eat in the morning to how we receive medical care. But the defining I guess one of the things that I'm kind of unsure about is, if the defining characteristic of a peasant class is being, in some way wedded to land, whether as a smallholder or as a laborer, right? Presumably expanding technology will actually remove the need for menial labor, and farmers will eventually find it cheaper to mechanize the entire farming process alongside, whereas, nowadays we have reports saying that peasants actually had longer holiday periods than today's proletariat. So I assume, obviously you don't mean this literally, but how do you perceive this sort of a growing techno-feudalism?
Yeah, sure. So the problem with any neologism, obviously, is it's an artificial sort of construct. It's just another way of saying some form of post-capitalist society that isn't the product of the popular sort of democratic forces, struggling and defeating elite forces and creating some kind of more egalitarian democratic future system, whether you call it socialism or communism or whatever. It's the product of elite forces and reactionary sort of social movements filling that void, which the left has sort of vacated, arguably since the end of the Cold War. Sort of envisioning its own sort of ideas of what an alternative to capitalism might look like, and in terms of why I call it techno-feudalism. There's a number of aspects of their sort of vision which do resemble sort of traits of feudalism. So I have a new article coming out in the Journal of Australian Political Economy this month, which is called "Will Neoliberal Capitalism Survive the Coronavirus Crash, or is this the beginning of techno-feudalism?" And so in that, I've sort of tried to argue that we're sort of living through, I mean, as a result of the coronavirus crash, and arguably, maybe we can talk about going back to the global financial crisis of 2008 as well, when neoliberalism sort of began this really deep hegemonic and legitimacy sort of crisis, where everybody suddenly sort of sees that the emperor has no clothes, and it's this system that doesn't seem to actually work. It seems to depend upon massive state intervention to keep it afloat. Things like quantitative easing to prop up the price of the stock prices of major corporations and banks, etc. In terms of why techno-feudalism, it's let me try and define it. Drawing on the definition I used in the article. Give me one sec. So I've defined it as a new form of political economy, which is being advanced by elites and reactionary social movements. It refers to a novel political economy evolving specifically out of the conditions of neoliberalism in the core nations of the capitalist world system. So I'm not arguing that it's sort of a neat, coherent global replacement for capitalism everywhere, not in the global south, not in, say, China, which obviously has its own sort of state socialist system, and lots of other countries where there are different forms of political economy that I think are going to be experimented with, going into this new sort of century of multipolar sort of order. So I use the United States as the sort of closest approximation to an ideal form of techno-feudalism within the core. So more specifically, I've used a really, really cool essay. I don't know if you guys have read Deleuze at all, but it's called Societies of Control. He wrote it in like 1992. It's ridiculously prescient of the whole sort of internet, sort of community capitalism sort of era, and the way in which we sort of think of these new technologies as providing individuals with liberation, but which actually end up forming new ways to control us. So, for example, like credit cards. Mobile phone technology, having your own Google, your own Apple, your own Facebook accounts, etc. These are all deeply surveillance sort of oriented systems of control. You know, everything you do is watched. Everything you do is commodified into data and uh, on sold to third parties to advertise new products to you. And these platform economy corporations are deeply embedded with the states. That they're sort of most closely tied to. So I'm sure you guys
Mm.
have heard before Facebook and Amazon and all of the big platform corporations, that they have like specifically designed interfaces that like the FBI or the NSA and all the other big sort of surveillance agencies, intelligence agencies can use, like to spy on every one of their users. And you've like signed up for this. It's all in like the fine print of their user agreements, which of course none of us actually read, but it's sort of, well, we're compelled to be on there, right? In order to actually exist in society today, you have to be a part of this sort of ecosystem of these platform apps. So anyway, going back to this Deleuze essay, I'll send you a bunch of links, by the way, Gemma, with like the key readings here, because I think it'd be really useful just to share those. So yeah, this is this new sort of system dominated by the ubiquitous presence of technology for social control. So we're thinking of things like mass surveillance, automation of production, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, by rentiers and oligarchs who actually own and control these platform networks, into which we're all being subsumed. And yeah, so it's very much a system that grows from the tendencies and trends that began in the neoliberal era, especially financialization and the rise of technology, which are two industries which are really deeply connected to the idea of basically obfuscating value and hiding from people how the actual economy works, so that it's sort of mystified and nobody can really ask questions of the people generating all of this massive quantities of wealth and power. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, it's also the rise of things like intangible capital, immaterial commodity production, and yeah, the sort of consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of this transnational oligarchy that seems to sort of crisscross the world, completely, unaffected by national borders. In one section of the article, I talk about. Do you guys remember the Panama Papers from a few years ago, like the leaks of
Yeah,
like
I do.
elite?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure yeah. Do you remember how many people went to jail as a result of like anything that was in the
From
Panama
memory, it was
Papers?
none.
It's it's zero, yeah. So the
Yeah.
point I'm trying to make in the article there is like, yeah, it's literally this class that, yeah, it doesn't have to follow laws. It's completely sort of cut off from society, and yeah, in a lot of ways, we've hinted at like the idea of a social contract in earlier sort of subjects we discussed before. That's sort of all broken down now. I mean, the popular class is very much sort of enclosed behind national borders and has to follow all these laws and has to be restricted and policed in all these ways by still existing national institutions. But this elite is completely liberated from that. They've no obligation at all, really, to sort of follow any laws. The Panama and the Paradise Papers revealed, I think it was $32 trillion in stolen wealth. And yeah, not a single person goes to jail. Not a single person, has to be punished in any way. Anyway, so I talk about four sort of features of this sort of techno feudal society. So there were, let me just check. So it was a new rent based economy. Okay, new class structures of techno feudalism, new forms of class subjectivity. So you mentioned before, techno anti oligarchs, techno precariat commoners. That's just a sort of shorthand for an elite versus a popular class. And the state under techno-feudalism. So I talk a lot about how the state's sort of been transformed, especially in terms of the state repressive apparatus, the state ideological apparatus, the way in which the sort of society of the spectacle has sort of been used for social control in the sort of internet platform economy sort of era. And yeah, it's all sort of about this idea of some sort of dystopian future. I've probably talked for way too long, so I want to, yeah, I'll take a breath there. And you
Yeah, so presumably this is predicated on the just complete collapse of the majority of small to medium-sized businesses as well.
go.
Because, I mean, that's presumably the goal of major sort of monopolies to begin with, but, it would be especially successful in the context of, massively wealth-generating tech companies. And to some degree, that is what has happened in the sort of coronavirus recovery. There's been what people have called a K-shaped recovery, which is essentially just meant that profits have risen for the top and gone, collapsed for everyone else. So do you see that as being a factor that mum and pop shops have no future as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all going to disappear. I mean that's been borne out. I mean, I'm calling you guys from Melbourne, and I read in the CBD, for example, 1/4 of all retail shops are completely vacant now.
Mm.
It's like that's never happened before. I don't think, not even in like the Great Depression. This is like, yeah, pretty historic. We're talking about like Amazon having increased like Jeff Bezos's personal fortune 65%. This is someone whose personal wealth is 200 billion and projected. He's projected to be the world's first trillionaire within about 5 years. So I mean, yeah, absolutely. The whole ecology of like small, even medium-sized businesses, I think, will be gobbled up by the platforms, one after another. It's pretty insane.
One of the things that I noticed is that it almost felt like Amazon. I noticed in parts of America, Amazon have opened up physical shops
Yeah,
where
yeah,
you can go in and actually buy things, but you're still technically buying it online via your Amazon account. You're just doing it physically.
yeah.
It felt almost like a way to sort of tease any sort of like small or medium sized businesses and say, look, we can replace you not just online, but in every other aspect as well.
Fully.
Yeah.
That's pretty.
What do you see, Christian? Do you think techno feudalism is a thing? Do you think this is just a new form of capitalism? Like what? How do you perceive it?
Well, what I think is accurate in terms of the moniker techno-feudalism is just the pure rent seeking that is part
Mm,
of all of this platform stuff. Like, what really has happened is that a large amount of things that could possibly be done as almost a free service, or through some sort of distributed community type thing on the internet, of which I think Wikipedia is probably one of the few examples left from when the internet was created, have just been enclosed and completely monetized. And what's actually happening in terms of innovation with the internet is that new ways of enclosing bits of this online land and extract and ruthlessly engaging in this rent-seeking practice has happened.
mm,
But I think that maybe a question that's worth considering is, I guess, it's been observed that this is a highly internationalized system, that you have this transnational capitalist class that is liberated from any sort of real need to follow the laws other than kind of the most sort of like bare minimum of observance whilst workers are enclosed. But I guess the question that's left is what happens when you have places like China, which don't really function in the same way as all of this, but is also incredibly innovative and capable in terms of what its own tech industry is capable of producing.
mm,
But it works a bit differently because they have a society and a state where they're kind of equivalent of one of these tech rent seekers, Jack Ma, got publicly humiliated 2 weeks ago by having the what was going to be the largest kind of stock offering or initial public offering ever done was abruptly cancelled at the last minute. That happened, and it turns out that the reason why it was abruptly cancelled is because Comrade President Xi Jinping said that it needed to stop, and there was all of these other new regulations coming out in the day before saying, we must break up trust, we must break up monopolies, and everything else. And Jack Ma has now 2 days ago had to make a public announcement. I think that these antitrust and these anti-monopoly laws are much needed for China's internet system. So it's, or like the Chinese economy and everything. So really it's an amazing thing where someone who was very much trying to become their version of Jeff Bezos or whatever, who was fully unaccountable, was basically publicly dressed down, was taken away for like questioning and probably to be angrily talked to, and has also had his plan to probably become one of the wealthiest people in history, or kind of rival Bezos in a whole heap of ways, be permanently ruined as well, because the Communist Party decided that there would be none of that happening within China. And what I think I'm willing to bet will happen, even from like the context of what's possible for the market there, and if they follow through with breaking up or undermining the capacity for monopoly control to deliver, is that China will be able to retain a extremely vibrant and innovative tech and digital scene that's previously been observed has been shut down more or less in Silicon Valley. That I would argue it's been shut down because of these monopoly processes that have occurred there, or the presence of these huge mega monopolies, which there's a chance that the ability for the monopolies that have emerged in China over the past 10 years, it just won't be able to happen in the same way. They might even be broken up completely, more or less. And this is a really interesting thing, because what happens if you have like the West tries to go down this techno-feudalist road? And I think that part of the new Cold War of China is a big part of it, but at the same time they undergo a deep stagnation, which I think it's fair to argue has already really occurred, or is in the process of occurring. Like you look at the fundamental scientific change or fundamental scientific discoveries or huge tech changes, really there's been an overall slowdown, more or less, with these new innovations and so on. And they've got a system which encourages the stagnation to occur, because that's what happens with monopolies under capitalism. It produces this concentration of wealth, but also the stagnation. But then you have that paired with a highly competitive system, which retains all of the dynamism and its capacity to innovate and its capacity to develop other things. And it also very much is operating in ways that are, in the future, I'd argue, are more and more clearly going in a socialist direction as well. Like this tech feudalism would be unstable in such a situation, I'd argue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also arguably, without socialism, the only thing driving technological innovation is primarily the military-industrial complex, and then secondly, the consumer market. And obviously, as we know, I mean, just look at iPhones, for example. We know that for the consumer market, they don't have to actually really innovate in order to keep people buying new things. It's mostly about branding. So yeah, that's probably one of the primary factors in this kind of stagnation. But I agree with you that there's a possible kind of internal contradiction. And one of the things that I've always thought would be something that may be something, an internal contradiction that eventually collapses in the context of this sort of growing tech monopoly, is that as net importers, our political classes and our capitalist classes are constantly looking for ways to maintain this system that is currently quite unsustainable right now, because we can't continue racking up debt without producing any new wealth. That's why Trump wanted war with China to begin with. But, an idea that I've kind of been toying with for some time now is, what happens when the data economy becomes the primary source of wealth in the West? And we are sort of heading towards that now. Can this actually replace a productive sector that we might have otherwise been forced to bring back to the West? So when you consider the reality of what could happen, it's probably not so far-fetched. The data economy is said to project $3 trillion in wealth by 2030. And as Marxists, we tend to talk about the labor theory of value in relationship to our work in the West, which is, of course, somewhat irrelevant to us currently, given that it's really only applicable to productive sectors, which we have little left of. But I mean, we can try to adapt it to the service sector. But I'd argue that, people who work in the service sector, and service workers are not creating wealth in the Marxian sense. The wealth has already been created for them somewhere in the global south, right? So what then if instead of bringing back manufacturing, Western countries seek to deal with these antagonisms via the data economy, because a data economy is not necessarily just what we may think of right now in the form of Facebook collecting our information, for example, but in extensive forms of behavior tracking. Medical companies paying people to track their every heartbeat and minor bodily function in order to produce better AI. Or that can be sold as replacement GPs, and companies tracking emotional changes in people seeking to better understand personalities. These are real jobs and real necessities for machine learning that open the door for people to become the product, and the precariatariat to replace other forms of work with the most sort of invasive forms of behavior tracking possible in order to create better and smarter AI. So if people become the product, that kind of sheds a whole new light on surplus value, in the sense that human beings become the constant capital in the Marxian sense. What do you guys think about that?
I agree completely. I think all those forms of affective and like immaterial labor are, going to be commodified, and there will be ways that corporations like the ones you've mentioned find to track every every little micro emotion and every single thing that human beings do in their day-to-day life, and it'll be necessary for them to do this. As more and more jobs are automated, and you end up with what this guy named Jonathan Harari, who I talk about in the article, talks about as a surplus class. So I mean, there's a real sense in which
Mm.
I mean, there's a palpable sort of fear of the idea that that you'll end up in light of automation and robotics and so on, with maybe half or more of the population. It's effectively like surplus to actual productive industrial capitalist society. There's no real need for them. So, I mean, what's the state to do about this? I think if those kinds of corporations are close and are influential with the state, then they'll repurpose it, in exactly the way that you're talking about. If they're not, that might be even more disastrous, because you end up with all these sorts of Malthusian sort of concerns about overpopulation,
Mm.
and one of the books I talk about. Have you guys ever read Peter Fraser's book, Four Futures: Life After Capitalism?
I've heard
No.
of it but not read it.
It's a really good.
Mm.
You should check it out. I'll share the link with you, Gemma, so you guys can read it later if you want. One of the four futures he talks about is like this version of dystopia, which is sort of influential on how I think about techno-feudalism potentially developing, and he called it exterminism, which is a term E.P. Thompson came up with in the 1980s in the context of like the nuclear potential apocalypse. And exterminism basically means like elites adopting a policy of either passively neglecting that mass of the population, which has become a kind of surplus or useless class, or whatever you want to call it. I don't like that term, but that's sort of what the language these people use. Or actively using like the full repressive apparatus of the state to exterminate like that section of society. So I think like this is not beyond like the realm of possibility. So in the final section of that article I mentioned before that I've just written, it's about the coronavirus crash and Malthusianism and exterminism. So I think you can see with the United States' reaction to the coronavirus crash, a kind of maybe we can call it like a very small scale miniature version of like what an exterminist policy and its implementation might actually look like. So as of now, I think it's about 12 million Americans who've caught the virus, and 250,000 Americans have already been killed by it. Right? So the government's commitment to keeping the economy open, no matter the cost to public health, is sort of reflective of a deeper dynamic that sort of reveals the oligarchy's contempt for the underclass, which it regards as, you know, surplus to the reproduction of their own society. You know, they don't necessarily think, you know, all of these people, are necessary at all to them. So, Engels has this term social murder, which he used in his study of the English working class. So I think this is sort of exactly what we're seeing in the United States' response to the coronavirus crash. I think in terms of the way they treated like Puerto Rico after the hurricane last year, again, you can see like a miniature version of how the response to climate change is going to play out in countries like the US. There are just whole sections of society that governments like Trump's are already willing to abandon. You know, and we're not talking about a trivial number of deaths here. Again, it's 12 million people who've caught the virus, 250,000 people have been killed by it. These are not small numbers, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that, you know, there's a Malthusian element to most of our current political classes and capitalist classes. You know, and I mean, there was an article more recently touching on this, arguing that in the context of a Cold War with China, coronavirus is an example of the fact that Americans can take losses, which is sort of a terrifying argument to be making, really. So I think, I mean, whether that's in the context of nuclear war, presumably it is, that's, I mean, frankly deranged. But I think more so the argument that I was making is, you know, if I were a capitalist, I think I would think a perhaps more peaceful or easier way of integrating the data economy to replace the productive sectors that have fled the West would be by actually giving people jobs as human monkeys, essentially. And that actually has been the case. Human monkeys for the AI, you know, for better at developing AI and so on. And what I mean by that is that, you know, for example, right now, there are people in parts of the West who are doing jobs where you're essentially just answering question after question about what did you do today, what did you eat, what did you, you know, whatever, those sorts of things, and they're getting a sort of minimum wage from that, and that is something that feeds back into AI and produces smarter AI. So that's, I think, one of my greater fears is that rather than leaving this surplus you're talking about of people who either rise up and, you know, storm the gated communities or whatever else, or, you know, are mass exterminated, more so that they're placated by this reality of at least the promise of a job in the data economy, where they are a very low level worker, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I worry that that all sounds completely plausible to me, by the way. But I worry that the way it'll be structured is that it'll still be competitive, so not everybody gets access to those. And those will probably be treasured jobs in the future, I guess. And it'd sort of be like a race to the bottom, and like everybody else who doesn't get to be the pharmaceutical lab, lab rat. They're still going to be part of this underclass, I think.
I guess the question I really have is, so say you're kind of getting all of these huge realms of data about this increasingly impoverished population, everything else. Like, really, what data is? It lets you choose to do things or make decisions about certain stuff, or it lets you really know how to solve all of these different sorts of problems. I guess the question I have is like, what good is having all of this incredible data and these really sophisticated AIs whose primary kind of innovating drive has really been to sell you products more effectively, even though most people can't really buy them anymore. Like, that to me is a contradiction that sort of exists in this question, because like we're premising on one hand that a large section of the population won't have access to jobs, or there'll be this vast or massive race to the bottom on one hand, and this all feeds into collecting data and people in a way which to me sounds qualitatively more than what it is right now. Like there's a leap into a different sort of quality compared to the data that's been collected now. And I'm not sure if I can see like a society that is stable necessarily from this sort of thing. Like if you carry out um, an extermination product, even like by neglect, which is what happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, you're starting to get things filter through right now, such as a collapse in the two-party system that existed on that island and a massive influx of left-wing candidates, both independents but also of left-wing political projects who are getting elected there, which is destabilizing that sort of framework, really. And like you will do something, there will be this action and will be this, we will neglect the population will suffer, but then there's always a reaction to this move by the capitalist class, and it sounds like an extremely dangerous and extremely unsustainable game that they're playing. And I'm also, like myself, not fully certain as to how this is qualitatively different from the Marx quote that I said before, where he talks about these powerful instruments for shortening labour time becoming the most unfailing means for placing every moment of the labourer's time and that of his family at the disposal of the capitalist for the purpose of expanding his capital. Like, I guess the only difference really in this situation is that these people are just people and they're not necessarily even labourers anymore. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to be a huge qualitative difference, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think my argument, albeit probably not a completely developed one at the moment, because obviously we can only really know in the abstract the real requirements of a growing data economy. But I guess my point was, is it possible to replace, with precariat work, a whole new sort of job kind of market for essentially being behavior tracked? To some degree it probably is, but I guess the real question is, right now there's no incentive for capitalists to actually pay people to do that because they don't really have to. And secondly, I suppose the only incentive would be if this contradiction becomes so intense, like both you, Christian, and Alex mentioned, such that capitalism begins to break down and is completely unsustainable. And I guess that was my question, because right now, if we don't have a data economy, as an example, we're already going to face the unsustainability or the internal contradictions that we face as a result of not having a productive sector, and essentially just using bond markets and the racking up of debt, in our the racking up of selling off debt in our bond markets, as being the only form of wealth generation or of stabilizing our currencies, for example.
Comrade, what I think really in relation to this is, I think the contradiction that would get capital in this case is the one that Marx identified between, I guess, planning within the firm and anarchy in the marketplace, which is these individual capitalists, they might recognize that it's in their interests in a way to be subsidizing the population so they continue to purchase their products. But in reality, if you're looking at kind of the firm level, or even at the level of planning or making decisions within these giant mega corporations, the only two things that are going to affect their decision making are going to be regulation or the kind of bottom line in terms of the profit kind of motive. And I don't see any regulation that can And then I don't see any regulation that would force these firms to directly subsidize um, their own users, when in reality what would probably happen if the pressure was becoming that extreme or that contradictory is that these corporations would be abolished as private entities, or they would be taxed kind of out of being, or they would be taxed to such an extent that it wouldn't be the problem that we see it as being at the moment.
I do think there are examples where capital develops a sort of conscious uh, measure for what they aren't willing to tolerate in terms of capitalism itself being unsustainable. You know, for example, here in Australia, the business some business councils support raising Centrelink wages because they recognise that it's necessary for their businesses to be maintained after, you know, several rolling recessions.
And
So
no, I
I
agree with
think
you. I
that
think it is interesting that the Business Council of Australia did come out with this, and I think it does reflects the capacity to organize within the capitalist class as a whole, which will include
mm,
these capitalists within these firms who I guess will be coming together through their various associations and organizations and talking about these problems. Um,
mm,
but I feel like it will lead to that sort of process will lead to an outcome that will kind of take things from the brink in terms of the specific scenario question that's been offered here, really, because there would end up being either an organized wealth transfer process, and this is something that happened in the past in relation to the threat that the Soviet Union presented. Like the capitalist class tolerated years of rising wages, it tolerated strong unions, and it's tolerated strong social democracy throughout the West as a way of preventing workers from looking over to the Soviet Union um, and the possibility of revolution.
yeah. In a way, I think as well, just to tack on one point, is the one thing that's discussed quite a lot at the moment is this Great Reset, which I think Pauline Hanson decided to denounce in Parliament or something like that, and it is conspiratorialized a lot. But I think to me, from the sort of articles that I've read from the actual capitalists who are promoting this idea of a great reset, it seems to me that it's just a big kind of conglomeration of some kind of retail capitalists and tech capitalists who recognize the reality that they have to create a more sustainable form of capitalism because they're essentially promoting, you know, a green capitalism that tackles won't actually tackle climate change, but that purports to tackle climate change. And, you know, I guess a way in which, you know, I think they're even promoting something akin to a guaranteed basic income. So to me, it seems like there is a recognition that if they don't do something, their time is up, or that their profits are threatened in some way. But I think for us as, you know, workers or as Marxist Leninists, in a way that's almost more terrifying because we don't want this sort of, while we're not accelerationists, we also don't want this sort of um, you know, structural embedding of a new form of capitalism that can last another 20 years or
I know, like we want everything to be on our terms, but I think that's another thing that's sort of tied to what you've just said is also once again the role of China. I'm not sure if any of you paid attention to the recent announcement of the 14th five-year plan, but part of the messaging that the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China put out at its first ever press conference that was broadcast live after the meeting of the Central Committee, where they finalized a whole heap of the targets for the 14th five-year plan, as they were clearly we've achieved modern prosperity and we are
mm,
embarking on a new journey to comprehensively build a modern socialist country by 2035. So I think really if this is what has been sort of set down by the National Reform and Development Commission in China, which is the planning agency and what the CPC is more or less committing to. And what that means is and this also was paired with other things like we will expand the middle class within China and reduce inequality, which pretty much is a coded signal for future wealth transfers of some sort. So it's not going to be possible for the West to hide for that much longer that socialism is in the process of being built very painstakingly and very slowly. But not only they won't be able to hide that not only is socialism being built in China, but that it also works and it's superior to capitalism. And within about 15 to 20 years, that will start to become a real existential threat for the existing elite over here, because they won't be able to hide the coming comprehensive material gains for that much longer.
Yeah. In many ways, it'll be like a more precarious moment for elites in like the core of the capitalist world system, I would think, than like the immediate aftermath of the Russian
It'll be far more
Revolution.
dangerous. It'll even be more dangerous than after
Yeah,
the end of the Second World War, because there was the potential for a second revolutionary wave after the end of the Second World War. That in many ways, capitalism's response in the post-war period was to try and suppress as much as possible, because China, as it is right now, is already more powerful economically, and in certain military dynamics, it's more powerful than what the Soviet Union ever was. And this trend is only accelerating, particularly with what has been kind of exposed through the COVID-19 crisis. You see America in disarray, but China advancing on all fronts, really.
Absolutely.
And I guess what we can hope for is that workers in the West and communist parties in the West increasingly begin to have a relationship with China that resembled what our historical relationships were with the Soviet Union. But even if that's not the case, even if China doesn't grow to be more outward looking in the future, the simple reality of the cultural influence of, you know, the clear successes of socialism, which is already happening to some degree under coronavirus. I mean, I even encounter on a regular basis people who typically wouldn't, you know, praise China for anything, praising them for their coronavirus response. So I think that, you know, it's already self-evident that that's going to be something that will occur, and I guess it's just a matter of how that contradiction for the elites in the West will kind of flare, so to speak. And I guess we can all hope that that's not in the form of this growing Cold War.
Well, there's some interesting tentative engagements, really, like the CPC donated millions of face masks to communist parties all across the world, including some to the Communist Party of Australia. I think they donated about 4,000 to 5,000 at the end of May, when the face masks were a really crucial part of dealing with the public health emergency. And it was good because we were able to use them to make the June 5th Black Lives Matter rally considerably safer than what it would otherwise be, by massively distributing to face masks people who didn't bring them there when it was looking like that rally was still going to be declared illegal.
And handing them out at community centres, right? Like
in community centres as well. Quite a few were able to go out to Indigenous health organisations as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is interesting as well is that, you know, in general, it's quite easy to have quite a dystopian view of the future of the expansion of technological production. But I guess, you know, where we can kind of look at these contradictions in play in a country moving towards socialism is obviously in China, because, you know, China right now undeniably engages in quite a heavy amount of behavior tracking. You know, they took to, you know, something else that people tend to fear in the West, which is a cashless economy quite quickly, and to, you know, the sorts of apps that grow AI and so on, and obviously cybersecurity as well, which they put up quite a lot of money into. But at the same time, you know, I guess it kind of raises this kind of ethical or moral question where we sort of say, okay, is this stuff innately bad if it's actually serving people? And so, I guess we kind of have to ask the question, well, in the context of a country where there are active social programs to eliminate poverty, and, these sorts of behavior tracking are largely going into, either defense systems or other forms of things that are arguably necessary for China in the current geopolitical scenario, the current geopolitical, era. I guess it kind of raises this general question. Technological production doesn't have to be innately bad if it's in a socialist context, and I think obviously the real time example of that is China, and that's where we need to be looking if we want an example of what the ways in which technological production could actually potentially serve people. Do you guys agree with that or no?
I agree with you, though we have to be conscious of China's own internal contradictions very much at the same time as that. But I think that people in the West and socialists and communists throughout the West need to also recognize that any society, even societies which are moving in fundamentally progressive directions, are going to have internal contradictions and are going to have internal problems and aren't going to be satisfactory. And they're just going to have to learn to live with it if they want things to really change, rather than be looking for a utopia that will never come, really.
Yeah, that's a very nice way of putting it. No, I agree completely, Gemma. Obviously, again, the way I've sort of thought about and tried to frame technology in my writing is it should be thought of as a field of struggle. It's not technology, being like deterministic in and of itself. It's like who owns it, to what purposes is it being put, and yeah, obviously, in the context of a socialist planned economy and socialist, highly advanced sort of progressive and egalitarian sort of economy. Yeah, it's going to be put towards very different purposes to what Jeff Bezos' vision of the world is.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, we're never headed towards any sort of innate teleological progression, whether it's towards a utopia or a dystopia. It's obviously reality is significantly more complex than that, and I don't think we can paint either in those ways. And obviously, I think the Western left have a tendency to try to do that. I think mostly just because we've culturally been embedded with religious thinking for quite some time. But where there is a sort of almost evangelical outcome, an ending or a resurrection. So I guess something else that has been on my mind at the moment is as CRISPR use expands and biohacking becomes more available, I wonder, will it increasingly be possible that augmented human beings will be something we'll look towards in the future? Can this be a force for good, and in what possible ways could it be negative? The most obvious one would be an inequality in access to biohacking. But, and then, of course, that has implications for eugenics, and I know even plenty of scientists are quite afraid of those implications, even if they are biohackers themselves. So I guess, this sort of, but certain forms of biohacking are already happening in Silicon Valley. So I guess it's kind of a question of, if CRISPR is something available to everyone, and it is, because I believe it's not patented, is it something that we actually just need to regulate, because there will be a black market for it anyway? What do you guys think about this?
Well, in terms of biology and everything, one of the reasons why I think that biology is, I think, been relatively slow going compared to, in terms of the advances in information, for instance, the discovery of DNA was a really quite fundamental discovery in a very similar way to certain advances in quantum mechanics. And others in the early 20th century were also fundamental advances. But you But from the discoveries that were made in physics in the early 20th century, there's really been an awful lot that has been able to come out of that very quickly. But with DNA and everything else, it's much slower. And I think it's a function of how complex biology really is and and the tools that you can use for biology. One of the programs that's happening at the moment with researchers who work in an area called synthetic biology is they're looking to create what are described as biobricks, so these standardized basic parts which you can then use to build structures or effectively living organisms or other kinds of biological structures or functions out of really. And as technology advances and as the much more is known, and because really not an awful lot is known, like certain things are known, but it's really in its infancy still. The power of these technologies to alter life and to alter ourselves will become really profound and extremely powerful in a whole heap of ways. And I think that it is something that these sorts of coming technological advances, which are sort of related in a way to artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence and the machine learning that's happening will really enable a lot of progress to be made in these fields. But we haven't really considered the full set of implications that could potentially come out of being able to modify humans first for medical reasons at first, such as eliminating genetic diseases from single gene mutations, which have really devastating impacts on the families of children that are born with them, or other people that have inherited genetic conditions that significantly reduce their quality of life. But it's easily conceivable that over time and as much more is known, that the capacity to do an awful lot to alter what it means to be human is done with that. I guess on one hand, that kills the human nature argument that's made against communism in a way that I think none of us expected. But but on the other end, there's also if you look at the application of this technology to, for instance, um, doing long-term space travel or developing spaceborne human civilizations in the future, the next 100 years or so in biological, in the development of biology and molecular biology and genetic engineering and so on, will probably be looked back in the future as the beginning of the Cambrian explosion of different post-human species. This is very long and rambly. But I think that there's an interesting discussion or an interesting conversation that we can have here about firstly what it means to be human, but also about the relationship of these new humans with the new technologies that are being developed and the efforts to merge these technologies and these tools with us and with people to a much greater extent. And I think that there's some stuff that we can probably think about really in with this. I would argue that in some ways this question or this discussion we're having, and it's a difficult one conceptually because of how to materially affect things. In many ways, it's actually a project of communism fully realized, in a way, even though there's some immediate things that can be demanded around ensuring that universal healthcare is actually universal. And I think it's kind of, we're almost back at that question again. It's about who has the power. And obviously, we want us, as working class people, to have the power permanently and forever. I guess there's one other interesting thing in relation in the vein of this discussion we've had about automation and these kind of future technologies, which is what happens to society if strong artificial intelligence is ever invented.
Yeah, I keep thinking of like Gattaca, that movie. Have you guys seen that? And Altered
Yeah.
Carbon, that Netflix series. It feels like so like we're on this predetermined path. I wish we weren't, and I wish we could like completely wrest ourselves from this historical moment and just like have control of technology and have this elite completely liquidated. But it feels like we're so like on that trajectory right now. It's hard for you to shake.
Well, I think it is important that we emphasize that we still have agency, right? I don't think if something as unstable and dystopic as some of the ideas that we've been discussing does come to fruition, that people are just going to necessarily lie down
No, that's right.
and take it.
That's right.
And one of the things that one of the reasons that we even talk about these things is so we can better understand how we can resist some of the worst aspects of expanding technological production. So yeah, I mean, even though some of these things feel extremely overwhelming, I do think that it's important to keep in mind that everyone does have agency still. And we are really more conscious than ever of our potential trajectories than any previous generation, I'd argue, actually.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm really glad, Christian, you mentioned before talking about the sort of immiseration and the reaction to immiseration. No, I agree completely. It's very troubling the sort of degree of isolation that technology sort of enables. I think a lot of that failure to understand theory and put social movement struggles in their broader political economy context um, is tied to the whole Francis Fukuyama sort of end of history phenomenon, starting with the end of the Cold War, where I think everybody, I would count most people on the left even today, they really bought into that thesis that with the end of the Cold War, we'd reached this sort of historic moment where there's just not going to be any more political struggle. There's not going to be any more sort of ideological conflict or no more class antagonism, none of the sort of narratives that we're familiar with from the history of the labor movement and the 20th century, and that's just over forever. So I feel like people still believe that even today. So we really have to, I don't know, find some way to fundamentally break that idea in people's heads that yeah, we've reached the end of history, and yeah, there's no more class struggle. We have to. That's one of the reasons I wanted to sort of talk about class struggle using a set of new terms rather than the sort of orthodox Marxian sort of nomenclature that's been around for now 150, 200 years. I feel like if we can articulate what's distinctive about like the platform economy and these sort of tech billionaire oligarchs, and what's distinctive about what we all have in common as people who are like exploited by this new system in fairly distinct ways, as opposed to just industrial capitalist production, then potentially we could actually see like the emergence of a new form of class consciousness, and like we could actually get people to wake the fuck up out of that end of history sort of fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that I find is sort of that it's slightly bereft on the left right now is that this kind of um you know sort of like folly where we think we can only apply 19th century theoretical analysis of capitalism to a modern capital. And that's why I like having these kinds of conversations, because it's just simply not possible. And it doesn't mean that we're, somehow betraying the religion, by acknowledging that. We aren't Salafis reading from the Hadith, where we're scientific socialists, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, our conditions are distinct in many ways from like Marxist time. So why shouldn't we talk about what's historically specific about this time, and the conditions that people are experiencing, and how we could actually go about trying to change that.
I think we might start to wrap up the conversation here. But Christian, is there anything you wanted to end on?
I think maybe just to finish it, in terms of advancing forward, I think that what really is important is to make like quite concrete analysis of the situations we really find ourselves in. And these discussions are part of how, as communists, we come to an understanding as to what the situation really is and how we kind of compare and talk about these ideas. I think that there's something that we've sort of, I think workers understand at a deep level that there is something really wrong with the system in which they live. Um, and that's part of the problem. Like Trotskyist organizations and many of the other left groups, they try to spend a lot of their kind of agitational or propaganda energy on trying to get workers to understand that they are exploited or oppressed or any of these other things and that they should rise up. But I think that workers understand that they're exploited or oppressed, but they don't believe that they can necessarily do anything. So one of the most important contributions that we can really make is to increase the sense of power and capacity to change things that workers do have. And it can be stuff that's relatively small in their everyday lives, or it can be a bigger or kind of broader project, or so on. And I think that we do need to be looking towards the everyday lives of ourselves and working people and how people experience things and looking for opportunities where we can make those interventions where workers do really feel the power. It's something I've tried to do in the past, kind of unsuccessfully, but continuing to like fail, but failing better each time is a good way to get better and better at it. And I think that this is an approach that we should really take, that we should be looking for opportunities in part of this broader discussion about that no workers, we do have power, we do have the ability to change things, and this is part of how we kind of assert agency and assert our capacity to change society and the world for the better.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, guys. I really appreciated this conversation. It was very interesting, I think. We touched on a lot of different things. But hopefully people leave with more of a sense of a hope than some kind of dystopian fear.
Thanks very much for having the discussion. And people should always remember there's lots of dark things happening, but there's always so many reasons to keep struggling as well.
Exactly.
Thanks, everyone, Gemma.
All right. Thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.
Definitely. All right. Thanks, guys.